We'll be starting up here in just a couple of minutes. We'll be starting up here in about another minute, minute and a half. I know it's the top of the hour, but we'll make it work. Okay, good morning. We're going to get started. My name is David Orr. I'm the director here with the Cornell Local Roads program. We're your New York State LTAP Center. And we're doing the second of our summer series of foundational webinars. Today is purchasing and financing. Um, we'll be doing a bunch of polls, so be ready for that. So as you see, this is the full schedule for the summer. We'll be doing some of them with professional development hour credits, some of them not, but all of them hopefully should be useful stuff to help manage your department and get things done. Okay. By the way, if you're wondering, this is Eagle Cliff Falls near Montour Falls. So if you haven't been on one of these webinars before, in the lower left corner of your screen, there should be audio settings if you get any sound issues or something like that. We do ask you to open up your chat pod, your Q&A pod. The chat pod, where we'll send you messages. That's one way to send out, but we can send you a link to a handout. We'll talk about that in a little bit, as well as to the polls, so you don't have to type everything in. The Q&A is where you can put your questions in. Please feel free to do so at any time. And I may ask you, in fact, I will be asking you to raise your hand a couple of times during the course of the webinar, and that's all on the bottom. So let's start with a welcome. And again, we're going to be using polyev.com/DavidOrPE. This helps me see who's on our webinar today. Okay, so it's really sort of a pretty day. So who do you work for? Town, county, city, or village? Oh, wait a second. Oh, we've got ourselves a poll that's not working. Okay, stand by. I'm going to stop sharing for just a second and restart the PowerPoint. It does this sometimes. And I thought we checked that. Nope. Give me about 15, 20 seconds. I don't know why it does this some days. But this should be happier. Okay. Now we'll share the screen again and we'll be back up and running. I don't know why Zoom does this, but hey, as long as we have a plan in place, right? And some of you have already answered because I had activated this one when we tested it earlier this morning. Okay, so we have quite a variety of folks. Okay, that's actually good to see. I like to see the variety from NPOs to authorities. Okay. Okay, that's good to know. Okay. Now, let's see. What's your job? What do you do? Are you administrator, highway superintendent, engineer, planner, field crew, supervisor, board member? You do whatever the boss tells you to do, none of the above. Okay, we got some people doing whatever the boss tells them. Okay, again, a pretty good variety. I like it. Okay, that's good. And then this is useful. Is it urban, rural? Just where are you from? You can actually click on the map. Just give me a click where you are, just because I'm curious. Amanda Kay is in the background helping out today. We haven't seen our person in the boat lately, so we used to have a person middle of Lake Ontario show up all the time. Maybe the Wi-Fi is not as good on the lake anymore. I don't know. Okay, that's good. Good variety. Thank you. Now, as I had said last week, I'm going to have a little fun. At least the webinars that I'm doing, I'm going to have a little bit of a fun question just as sort of a way to do a little icebreaker. Last week we asked for your favorite flower. This week we'll ask for your favorite color. And I'm not going to let anybody see the answers till everybody's put theirs in. So quickly put your answers in. We'll see what everybody's answers are together. So we hear what we have here. Okay, let's see what our answers are. And favorite color, blue, looks like our winner today. Okay. Maybe everybody was cheering for the teams that wear blue in the World Cup. And by the way, as a reminder, if you can't access the polls for whatever reason, go ahead and put your answer in the Q&A. I'll read those and make sure we don't miss your answers. Somebody had put in blue in the Q&A as well. Now there is, if you are interested, again, if you've opened up your chat pod, we'll repost it, but there is a handout that goes with the webinar. We always do a handout, and it's not showing up on screen for whatever reason. The main reason I want you to have the handout, it has an outline of what we're talking about, but really the key is it has references that you might want to look at later on, resources that we're going to be talking about. You don't have to write down then any of the links that I talk about during the course of the day. Okay. Now, we're talking about purchasing and financing, but we really need to start just remind ourselves what are the responsibilities. And we asked this question in some of the other webinars too, but it's just a reminder. Why do we have to purchase things? Why do we have to finance things? So what is the responsibility of a highway department or a department of public works? Obviously, safety for the public, that's a pretty important thing. What else we got? You got to maintain the system you've already got. Yeah, that's pretty important. Okay. Cost control, things like that. But what kind of things do we actually maintain? What do we actually have to maintain? Because most of the things you're talking about, there we go. Plowing. We got to plow. We got to maintain a snow plow. Yep. Bridges. Yeah. What do we actually have to pay for? Okay. And we need to do that. Taxpayer trust, somebody put in depreciating assets. Yeah, that's true. But if you think about it, we've got to maintain and do certain activities. So we've got signs, we've got roads, we do snow and ice controls, we got bridges. Um, we may have additional duties that we have to deal with. So there's different responsibilities. And most of you probably get to do things that are not considered highway, even if you work for a highway department. And if you're in the consulting world, you're certainly going to be pulled in on other projects that a municipality might do, including cemeteries, parks, the town hall, recycling, waste management, leaf pickup, even some electricity and garbage collection. So there's all kinds of responsibilities. And this is not a session on accounts. That's a whole different webinar that we also have in the standard webinar set. But it's just something to keep in mind. And as we're talking about this, money, of course, matters. We actually do a survey every year asking folks about different things, including this year, we're asking about assets. In fact, we'll have some of those results here pretty soon. But a couple of years ago, we asked, what would you do if you had an extra $10,000, which we'll talk about when we talk about financing. And people, if they had only 10,000, they'd probably do some extra road maintenance, maybe buy a couple of small pieces of equipment. But if you had $250,000, you could do even more. And roads and equipment were still on the top of the queue, But I actually like the fact that a lot of folks, as you can see, about 15% said, we'd spread that out. We'd do a whole bunch of little things with it. And that probably makes a lot of sense. So when it comes to our department responsibilities, yes, we need to think about doing things and improving safety, but we have to maintain all of this stuff, which leads us to the first half of what we're talking about, which is the budgeting part of things. Now, everybody has a budget. You have an operating budget, okay? You probably should have a capital budget. So again, I told you I'd ask you to raise your hand. Raise your hand if you have, even if it's within the A or DA accounts, a capital budget, something you can honestly say you have a capital budget. And it could be for equipment, it could be for roads, it could be for bridges, but you actually track a capital budget versus just operational, okay? And you really should have that. You really need to have two budgets that are working together. That's actually pretty darn important. So keep that in mind. Now, you may actually have, we know this happens, you may have specific projects, and we'll talk about that under the financing section, where you get money to do a project like a bridge or a safety improvement or something like that. But again, that project is going to have a capital component, something you build, but you're going to have to maintain it later on. And you need to think about those two things together. And if you do that well, you'll actually spend overall less money. So really just keep in mind the idea that there's two budgets working together. The annual budget, and then you may have a capital budget that you want to track separately. And again, we're not talking about the accounting issues today in our 1 hour together. Now, if you're interested in sort of understanding how some of these things work, at least from the state comptroller's standpoint, one of the resources in the handout is a document put out on capital assets from the state comptroller, and it's aimed at local governments, and it talks about your capital assets. Now, the way the comptroller defines capital assets is things that have more than 1 year life. Now, when you come to using your CHIPS funds from the state, that's a 10-year plus life. And so there's overlaps of all of these things just to keep it in mind. But capital assets from the comptroller is things that are tangible that have more than 1 year life, which is, of course, your buildings and your equipment, but also includes your bridges, your roads, your guide rail, your signs, things that have a longer life. And when it comes to long-term maintenance, 10 years is actually probably a good thing to look at from a infrastructure standpoint, but 1 year makes sense from a equipment and buildings and things like that standpoint as well. Okay, so there'll be some overlap. I understand that. And let's actually look at a plow truck as a good way to sort of get into this discussion as we're talking about budgets. Now, a plow truck is not a cheap tool, but it's a critically important tool that everybody has to have. And so to understand the capital budget, we need to think about the fact that, at least from the comptroller, we're talking about things worth more than $5,000 that you need to track. Now, you may have a different procedure. You may track things down smaller than that. I know of agencies that are trying to inventory capital assets down to only a few $100s. Here at Cornell, they don't care about the price, they care about the lifespan. And so they track even our computers and stuff like that, even though those can have a fairly short lifespan, but it is more than 1 year. So that makes some sense. And then how low you go is something that's important. Now, how many of you have a procurement / inventory policy that you follow for everything that you own? How many of you have one? Let's see, there's 34 of you on the call or on the webinar. Let's see how many of you raise your hand. I'm hoping at least half, but we'll see. Okay, so only a few of you. You probably should have a plan for what inventory you want to track on a regular basis. And again, you're not going to track every single bolt, though you might want to do an inventory on that at least once a year. In fact, if you're with a town, you're supposed to do machinery and equipment and even repair tools at least once a year. Now, capital equipment has a detailed lifespan. And the question I always ask for that is, do you know it? Okay. So again, let's look at our plow truck issue. Okay. Now, a plow truck, I've asked people lately what the cost of a plow truck is. I'm using a number that's sort of an aggregate and rounded on purpose because it makes the math easy. But, it's amazing people don't realize a full truck, 10-wheel dump truck, all the equipment, all the accoutrement, wing, everything else is essentially about a third of $1 million. I'll use 360,000 as sort of a aggregate number that we're going to do with, just because again, it makes the math easy, but you could go and get prices from your neighbors and see how much things cost. And then just because I'm curious, I have a number of what I think the life expectancy should be, including the maintenance. That's key, including the maintenance. How long between you when you buy a new truck. But in the Q&A, put in there how long you think a truck should last. How long would you keep a plow truck typically? 15 years? Okay, I got a 15 in there. Okay. 15, 10, 12 to 15, 10. Again, you could set this up for your own system. Okay. I'm using 15, not because I think 15 is actually the best number. I think less than 15 would be a really optimum number, but I'm also a realist and know that that's not an atypical value. You could actually take your existing fleet and figure out the average of it and use as a starting point and then decide whether you think that's long enough or not. And again, that 15 is with maintenance. You can't just buy it and forget it. We know that. Okay. So if you're trying to budget for this, you have $360,000 for the new truck, 15 years, you need $24,000 a year in your budget to replace that truck on average. Okay. Which is why it's important to have a capital budget. Now, when you actually put in together the budget, do you need to budget for 350 or 24,000? Well, if you're trying to do it on an annual basis, it's 24, but the year you buy it, you got to have $350,000 available in cash and things like that. And of course, that's just the cost of buying the equipment. That doesn't include other costs. So let's just ask, what other costs are there to own and operate a plow truck? And I was going to make this one later, but I think I'll go ahead and let you guys see everybody else's responses. What are the costs? Yeah, you got to have the maintenance of that. Okay. You're going to have the fuel, the oils, the fuel, the gas, what are called consumables by a lot of the documents. Okay. So you've got maintenance cost, which may be consumables, but a lot of times it's separate. And then you have the consumables, the gas, the tires, the things that wear out on a regular basis, and somebody threw tires over into that, both on the screen too as well. Insurance is part of the cost. You got to have insurance, as someone put over in the Q&A. Okay. If you've got a snowplow, you might have to have a brine tank or a separate thing to make the brine. Oh, I like that one. Storage. That's good. That's really important. How do you store it? Do you store it inside, outside, heated, unheated space? Does that make a difference to the lifespan? And then, of course, the salvage cost. If you sell it early enough, you might get a good salvage cost. If you don't, it just becomes junk and you don't really make that much. You barely cover the cost of getting rid of it. And these are all things that really need to be thought about. And of course, if you financed it, there may be an interest cost. And so these are all things you sort of have to think about. And so while we have a capital budget, really have to think about the operations themselves. Now, we have a very simple formula. We've shared this with lots of folks. It's on the handout. This does not include any kind of inflation values. If you want the inflation formula, let us know. We can get it to you easily. But it's a good starting point. And if you can get your budget to go up with inflation, even if it has a lag, so, we're probably behind this year because of higher inflation, but we'll catch up next year when inflation comes back down. Long term, you can keep it. This number actually works pretty well. So let's just assume we have 5 trucks in our fleet. And at $360,000 per truck divided by 15 times 5, we need to have an annual amount in our capital budget just for those trucks of $120,000. Okay. And of course, that's just the trucks. That doesn't include any graders or rollers or loaders or any of the other things that are part of our fleet. That's just the capital portion. That's just the cost of getting it. Okay. So when you're developing your budget, you have to think about the capital cost, but you also have to think about the maintenance cost and those consumables. Those will show up in your annual budget versus your capital budget. And then, do you want to get salvage money back? Now, when you set that up, make sure you set it up with the board very carefully. that the money that is brought back in from salvage, i.e. auctioning or selling off that older piece of equipment, goes back into the highway fund. It doesn't default there. It has to be set up that way. I've know of lots of agencies that find out the hard way the money went back in the general fund and it didn't really help the highway or DPW accounts. So keep that in mind. And there are, of course, lots of other things we have to think about. Someone had mentioned the facility. You've got to maintain the facility. And of course, that creates accounting issues, which again, that's a different webinar for a different day. Now, when do we replace all of this stuff? This is a general curve. Very hard to do on a single piece of equipment, but it's a good reminder. There's the cost, the fixed cost, which typically go down over time due to depreciation. There are repair costs that go up. And when those minimize, that's when we want to replace the piece of equipment. Again, hard to do on a single piece, but can be done at an aggregate level. And by the way, you'll notice there's no consumable cost in here. The assumption is those consumables are consistent, and they're being used anyway, and they're annual. And this just be a flat line would bring everything up. That may or may not be true, especially if a piece of equipment starts using more fuel, burning a higher amount of fuel or oil or tires. So some people will put the consumables in this chart as well. So let's take all of this now and start purchasing things, okay? So we'll come back to how we pay for it with the financing portion, but let's talk about purchasing a little bit. Now, when I say purchasing, I mean having a policy in place. So raise your hand if you have a policy for purchasing before we get into this. Raise your hand. Everybody should raise your hand. If you don't have one, you really should get one. I think we have a purchasing policy on our website from a couple of municipalities, but we can confirm that. Might even be able to throw it in the chat. We'll see. Purchasing means you're going to have when you can go and do what's known as a direct purchase. You can just send someone down and go buy small parts and things like that. You're going to have purchases where you have to at least get quotes from 2 or 3. 3 is the minimum typically, but at least call 3 people, even if you only get 2 answers. It's called an oral quote, but it's actually written down in a log. You keep the log, though. I talked to so-and-so at Granger, I talked to so-and-so at the local Walmart, and I talked to so-and-so at the local Agway to buy some bolts, and we're going to go get them from the cheapest, which was Agway. And that can include the delivery cost, by the way. That is actually acceptable. You think at some level, you're going to have written quotes where you're not going through a full bid procedure, but you've got a written quote that you get from somebody. And then eventually you have to get to the point where you have bids. And we'll talk about the bid numbers in a little bit. We'll also talk about exceptions to those bid numbers. Okay? Now, when it comes to purchasing limits here in New York State for municipalities, bids are required for purchases over $20,000 and public works over $35,000. Okay? So you have to go out to bid. A local municipality can lower that. Okay? It looks like we don't have a sample purchasing agreement on our policy page. So if you have one you like, would be willing to share, email it to us and we'll post it on our website and we'll share it with everybody. We always like to get good policies from folks. But you have to go out if it's above 20 or 35,000. The challenge usually for most people is what is considered public works. Okay? If you're buying a thing, pretty easy. If you're buying an installation of something, it gets a little bit more challenging. So let's just ask, which of these 4 items, there's actually 4 on the screen, the guide rail one is towards the bottom. I'll scroll a little bit so you can see it. Okay? Which one of these would be considered public works versus which one is considered a thing, a purchase? Okay? So which one of these would be considered public works? Now, you're actually getting multiple votes, but the way Poll Everywhere shows it, they show total percentages. I don't know why they do that. I wish they didn't, but that's just the way it is. There's some things in the polls that I like, and there's some things we just have to go and deal with what we've got. Okay, let me find my mouse. Where did my mouse go? There it is. Okay, so essentially, just about everybody agrees crack repairs would be considered public works. So if you're doing $35,000 more crack repairs, you're going to have to go out and going to have to get that taken care of. Guide rail installation. Yeah, yes, it's installed, but really the value is the actual installation. That's public works. It gets a little bit more challenging. The salt truck, that's a purchase. That's an item. That's not a public works activity. That's a pretty easy one. It should be. You're buying a thing. Okay. Even if you ask for training that comes with it, you're still buying a thing because at the end of it, you have this item. Okay. That you could go pick up if you needed to. It's a good way to think about it. Could you go pick it up? Installing gas tanks for the garage? Probably you could call that public works because of all the other things that go with it, the wiring, the setup, the electronics. If you're just buying a tank, an actual tank that you install, that would not be considered a public works activity. That would be a thing. If you just bought the plain tank that sits on the ground. And so it's not always as easy as you might think. If you're not sure, go ask, because there have been cases where someone said, well, it was public works, and no, it turns out it was actually a purchase and they were over the bid limit of 20,000. Okay. Now, in New York State, when you get to those limits under finance law, it's finance law 163, if you care, you can actually use something called best value rather than the lowest responsible bidder. Now, I will put an asterisk on that twofold. One is if you're doing federal projects, you have to use lowest responsible bidder. You can't use best value. Best value has to be measurable, quantifiable. You can't just say, well, we like this one better. You have to have some basis and it has to be included in the paperwork. So for instance, if you wanted to choose between two plow trucks, you could put a best value that would include maybe gas mileage or the gross vehicle weight, how much it can carry, things of that ilk could be included as long as you have a scoring system that makes sense. Not a lot of agencies use it, but if it is something you want to think about using, you can investigate it, but make sure your finance people are on board. Now, I just want to quickly go through what people use for their limits for their policy. And if you don't have a policy, you may want to put one together. So based on what we've talked to people, and again, I thought we had one, but we'll go find a policy. What is your limit for how much money your agency can spend before you have to go get uh, oral quotes? In other words, you can just go out and just talk to people. What's your limit? Is it 500? Is it 500 to 1,000? 1,000 to 200? Over 2,000. In other words, if it's less than those amounts, you can just go buy it. If it's in those ranges, you're going to have to get permission. Let's just go see. And where'd my mouse go? It is being persnickety today. And so most of you, your oral limit quotes, as low as 500. Okay. And then most of you are, the highest percentage of you is at about over $2,000. Okay. So you actually have a limit that's pretty high that you can just that you need to get quotes, but that's okay. How about written limit quote? When do you have to go get written quotes? Not full bidding, but you have to get a written quote. So we're doing something like painting the town hall or purchasing a small mower from the local tractor supply company. Okay. And again, we'll click on your responses and see what you get. Okay. So some of you way down under 1,000. That's pretty low. I have seen that. That's extremely low. 1 to 5 is not atypical. Most of you are 5 to 10. Okay. So essentially, you have to go start getting written quotes above $5,000 to $10,000. A few of over 10,000, and about a quarter of you don't really know. Okay. You should have a limit for that. And don't set those numbers too low. Again, the most common number we see is people can just purchase up to anywhere from 100 to 500. They have to go oral quotes above that number up to 2 or 3 to 5,000, and they have to get written above that number. And the number you guys have 5 to 10 is not atypical. Okay, they don't have to be complicated. In fact, I would advise you to not make this super complicated. Have a standard procedure in place. Maybe even have a mini form that you fill out so everybody's consistent of what you're asking for. The key is treat it like a bid. Get good information that you can compare apples to apples. Okay. So again, if you're going to go buy a brand new mower for mowing the town hall or mowing the highway department garage, around the highway department, just a little guy that, under $1,000, still have a policy in place on what are you looking for. You're still writing a spec, but it's not as complicated. Okay. Now, what are some exceptions to bidding? Um, Actually, I'll tell you what, I'll be nice. I'll let you see each other's responses. Give me some exceptions to bidding. There's about a dozen of them, actually. An emergency. We'll definitely talk about emergencies. If you're using the state contract, yep. Yes, sole source. I don't have a slide for sole source, but that is an exception to a point. It's not as much of an exception as you think. You can sole source for some things. So, for instance, you could say we always want to buy Ford as our trucks. But in that particular case, you would still have to go out to bid if you're buying a new truck. You just could say we're only going to be buying Fords because the board approved only buying Ford trucks. Southwest Airlines only buys Boeing 720, 737s. That's all they buy. That's all they buy. Well, that's fine, but they still technically, in the government side, might actually have to find other manufacturers. But that's a true sole source. There's only one supplier. But if it's something you're buying from different vendors, you might still have to go to bid. So be careful about sole source. Uh, Contracts, there's two I don't see on here. I was hoping you guys would do. State contracts, there's county contracts. Professionals in there, that's good. We'll talk about surplus supplies in a minute, and also leases is one that comes up, and of course our friend piggybacking. So let's go look at some of the more critical ones that people use. Now, there's OGS contracts, the State uh, Office of General Services contracts. How many of you use the state OGS system? You probably should look at that. It's a useful thing. There are some areas it's good at, some that are not. Um, this again is linked in your handout. You may want to look at those. You could do crack repairs via a state contract. Someone else already done the work. You can just pull off that, and they usually have a cost in each different county or region of the state. Um, there's some things that used to be on there that are not, and there's some that have been, they're working on trying to add them back in. You can also use county contracts. Okay, again, this happens to be the county contract for Tompkins County. You just search Tompkins County highway materials, it pops right up. The idea is if you are a municipality inside of a county and a county does a contract, you can use that contract as long as they haven't created an exception that says you can't. Okay, so generally that's a good way for localities, towns, villages, even cities to take advantage of a contract because they're considered a political subdivision. Okay. Leases are considered an exception. Okay. You can lease equipment. Okay. It has to be approved by the board. And here's the key. This is where people usually get in trouble. You can't do lease to purchase. Okay. Or rent to own. So you can't go rent lease a roller or rent a loader for the summer. And then at the end of the summer say, well, we've paid you $10,000 for renting it over the course of the summer. And for another 10,000, you can buy it. That's considered a lease to purchase. That's a purchase. And if you have to go back to your purchase amounts at that point, okay? You could do that. You could actually lease it to spread the cost out. We'll talk about financing here in the last 20 minutes. But those limits still come into play. So the total amount you pay would fall into that. So you can't do lease to purchase, but you can lease things. You can do things internally, force account work, okay? You can do things internally, but there are still limits you may want to come up against. For instance, if you're getting CHIPS funds and all of its associated kin with CHIPS, the total cost of the project cannot exceed $350,000. Otherwise, you have to go back to the bidding limits and you're going to have to go out to bid in that particular case, okay? You can do professional services. This would include hiring doctors and lawyers and engineers. In fact, you're not supposed to use cost as a driver when you're doing professional services. And then, of course, the question is, what counts as a professional service and what's something that you could put under the proposal or best value process? You still have to have an RFP type process for quality. So it has to be a quality-based selection system in place. But that's not considered a bid process. And again, we just don't have the time to go into the details for this. Um, this is one I want to make sure you didn't forget about, and this is surplus and secondhand supplies. You can buy used equipment without going through the bid process. You still need to get approval from the board, but it has to be from another, essentially government or public benefit corporation, i.e. the thruway. You could actually get something from the thruway or even a local water authority. Okay. This happens to be a grader that the folks at Alfred State got using that system, where they bought an old state grader to use for their classes on heavy equipment. Okay. Because they're allowed to do the same rules for getting surplus equipment. The auctions that are out there that are available, there's lots of surplus auctions where they sell off old municipal equipment, fall into this particular category. Before you go, though, the board has to authorize how much money you're allowed to spend. They can do that, by the way, without public notice. There's rules around that. It does eventually have to become a public record, but there's a way for them to not have to tell up front what their limit would be. Otherwise, the people selling it might know all the amounts. But make sure you understand that process. But you can get secondhand equipment. And if you are not using the secondhand equipment system from the federal government, you might want to do that. We put a link in the handout for that as well. Now, let's just do a quick thing on piggybacking. How many of you use piggybacking? Raise your hand if you use piggybacking. If you don't know what this is, piggybacking was set up a few years back to allow not just a county contract, but you could use anybody else's contract, another town, a county that's not your own, and even national contracts like Sourcewell. Now, first off, it has to be approved by the board in advance. Okay, so the board has to take proactive action to do piggybacking. It has to also be included in the contract that was prepared. So a county contract has to specifically include language that says other counties can use it. Other towns outside the county can use it. It's not default that you can use a county contract in another county or use a town contract in another county. Okay? And there are some exceptions, especially when it comes to the public works side of the house. And we could spend a lot of time on piggybacking. And people say, oh, piggybacking's been ruined. No, there's some exceptions. So we don't get in a situation where the bids get out of control and we're nearly not doing the good competitive agreements between companies. Okay. So piggybacking is an extremely valuable tool. If you're not doing it, I would advise you to get the board on board. And then you could actually write a contract where you could actually write up a single contract that multiple towns could use, even across the county boundary. And that could be very useful. And you get that buying power, the same buying power you get on state contracts and county contracts. Now, emergencies, I don't want to forget about emergencies. Emergencies are going to happen, whether it's not if, it's when. But here's the thing. You can go outside the purchasing policy for an emergency, but it has to be an emergency. It can't be, oh, we really wanted to get it done before Juneteenth. No, that's not an emergency. An emergency is something that is unforeseen, okay? A major flood, a large crash, a snowstorm that dumped more snow than anybody thought possible. Those are emergencies. The fact that it happens to be 3 weeks before the election is not an emergency, okay? And people have tried to claim things are emergencies, and while they get away with it for a while, the courts have been pretty consistent, saying, no, that's not really an emergency. And then, of course, what does that look like in the paper? Now, in terms of an emergency in your annual budget, you need to modify any agreements you've got. You may need to revisit the budget. If you're with a town, you have to modify your 284 agreement. You may be able to access short-term reserve funds that were for capital work. Okay. Again, depending on how the funds were set up. You could even do a budget transfer from another portion of the budget. Now, if it's above $5,000, it has to have board approval. And which accounts you can access, it depends on the situation. Some accounts you can't access because of the way they were set up. Some accounts you can access, but you have to reimburse it. So for instance, let's say you did have a flood that washed out, in this case, a road/dam, and you wanted to fix it, and there wasn't enough money short term in the highway, but you thought you'd get funds eventually from, you know, the FEMA folks. Well, you could use the A account temporarily to pay for that, or even again, if it's not set up where you can't do it, one of your reserve accounts. But here's the thing, you have to reimburse that account before the end of the fiscal year. Before the end of the fiscal year. So keep that in mind. Okay. So keep those things in mind. There are lots of other contingencies that we can talk about. Let me answer a couple of the questions in the Q&A, and then we'll move on to financing. So the first question was, we were told it's illegal to use a Sourcewell by our finance. It's not illegal to use Sourcewell, but there are lawyers who feel that it is not legal. Okay. And again, if your local financial folks and legal folks don't want you to use it, you're going to have to go with that because they're the ones that are going to have to defend you. Usually that runs into problems because, again, it might be really more of a public works activity, and there's some rules about that you can and cannot do. And so you may want to limit it to what portions of Sourcewell you're allowed to use. Okay, so keep that in mind. There are lots of rules for piggybacking, more than we can possibly cover in a foundational webinar of 1 hour. But it can be done, but there are some limitations. Can do curbside bids too to help keep competitive. Mini bids are sometimes called, if that's what you're thinking about. Mini bids are feasible, but there's a process that has to be done. The state contracts have mini bid systems where you can get competition, but you have to do it in a way that is fair. Here's the way to think about those kind of activities. Imagine, let's just say, for instance, let's say we've done equipment before. Let's just say that you were going to be doing buying grass seed, okay? And you want to do just a quick, what they call a mini bid. You already had a contract with an amount, but the mini bid process is available. Well, everybody who possibly could quote on that was part of the original contract has to be informed. So they can all decide, do I want to buy this special grass that's at the edge of the contract, or the mini bid? If the answer is no, then you really shouldn't be using that particular process. And all emergencies must follow the proper process with Public Safety and Department of Emergency Management. Well, that comes back to, do you have an emergency management policy? A lot of agencies do not. And then you start getting into some what counts and what doesn't count. So that's when you, as part of your emergency policy that you've got, how you deal with emergencies, you may want to put in there what counts as an emergency. And then everybody's on board with the same page. So when you declare something, nobody can go, well, that's not really an emergency. Okay. Usually has to be approved by the board, but again, there are exceptions to that, and you should probably get that down. Okay, so let's spend our last, we got 17 minutes. Let's talk a little bit about financing. Now, we have a whole webinar on the sources of funds, but we'll talk about the sources of funds fairly quickly this time. And I just want to make sure we think about the types of funds when we're thinking about the sources of funds as well. Okay. And of course, this all comes back to the fact that for the most part, we're funding with local funds. Okay. For towns in 2022, as you can see, about $1.4 billion for towns in New York State, according to the State Comptroller's Office. Excuse me. Yeah, no, Comptroller's Office. Yeah. 83% of the funds were local funds, about 14% state, mostly CHIPS and its related kin, only 3% federal. Villages, almost exactly the same. Counties do get more state and federal aid, but they do additional things in transportation, and cities similar. Okay, but still, even in the case of counties, it's almost 2/3 is local funds. And so when we need to think about our sources of funding, we have local funds, of course. We'll talk about those in a minute. We have state funds, federal funds, what we didn't mention in the what pie chart was there are also private funds, okay? And we'll talk just briefly about those for a second. Maybe grants. Those grants could be local, state, federal, or private. I just want to spend a minute or two on those. And then you may borrow money to finance things. You borrow money because there's a cost to borrowing money, but it can spread out the cost of purchasing something as well. Since we're talking about these things, remember, funds could be taxes and fees that the public pays in one form or another. They could be allocations from other groups who've either collected them in taxes and fees, or in the case of private things, it could be they're allocating money to help out. It could be a grant, okay? And allocations and grants are a little different. Allocation, they're just giving you the money, okay? So you may have to show documentation. CHIPS is an allocation, okay? You get it because you have roads. A grant you put in to get money, and there's usually a match with those. And of course, it might be a loan. And more commonly, though, you'll actually have combinations. So a lot of the funds to actually replace water systems are grant programs with a loan. So the grant might be for 5 million and a loan of another 5 million. That has to be paid back off, and there's a cost to that. So you have to include that in your stuff. Okay. So let's just go through this. Let's think about local funding. What are your sources for your local revenue? What kind of sources do you have? Taxes, but what kind of taxes? So we like to say taxes, but there's really lots of different types of taxes, and those taxes affect people in different ways. Okay? So you could have a millage or property tax. Yeah, so that's one form of a tax. Everybody who owns property pays that tax directly. Everybody who rents property pays it indirectly. Okay? You might have a county tax. Okay, but again, what's it based on? You could have a sewer tax. It's based on sewage use or even just owning sewage. Okay? Gas taxes. Okay, now those gas taxes typically, those are most commonly at the federal and state level, but there are some local gas taxes. Okay, you might have user fees. Okay, you could technically have tolls. Not, I don't see too many local tolls, but you could have tolls. Okay, most of those tend to be at the state or larger area. Okay, there's two particular ones I'm looking for that local ones we don't always think about. CHIPS is actually a state revenue. Okay, I'm talking local revenue paid by the via the local government. Registration fees, yep. Traveling taxes, bed taxes are sometimes called for hotels and stuff like that. Water and sewer. Yeah, there's actually some revenue from tickets and things, which creates a bit of a conflict. Permits, yeah. Um, we've done fees. The two I didn't see that are important. Remember, financing may not always be a financing for the whole government. It may be for a single department. You may have an interfund transfer. You may get money because the highway department does work for the town hall. That should have a money going back to the highway department because it actually comes out of a different account. And then the other one is something called a pilot, a payment in lieu of taxes. For entities like here at Cornell, they pay a pilot to the local governments because they're tax-free. And those can create some animosity. I know that. But again, you got to think about those sources of revenue. Okay. So again, mortgage taxes, property taxes, sales taxes. They could be on gas. It could just be straight sales tax, bed and tourism taxes. You may get revenue for working from another municipality, the pilot that I already mentioned, and the fees, of course, collected for service and licensing. And then just as a reminder, there is this interfund transfer. That's not new money to the municipality, but it might help the highway department short term, and it should be done if you're working on things outside the particular account. How about state aid? What do we have for state aid? And again, we're going to go through this one pretty quick. I'm looking for 3 answers, and then we're going to move on. Let's see what people come up with for state aid. Again, we have a 1 hour version of this webinar where we go into a lot more detail about things like this. Let's see what sources of state aid. Somebody put in the Q&A CHIPS. Yep, CHIPS is absolutely a state aid. Pave New York, that's part of, I call that the whole state local aid. Okay, could be tolls. Yep. Marcia Selly is part of the state budget that goes with the bridge program, helps with federal dollars. And we'll talk about that Bridge New York here real quick, okay? Just to keep in mind where the money comes from. Yep, chips. Okay. So let's go through and look at a couple of the critical state aid things. There's the state aid to localities through the Local Programs Bureau. That includes CHIPS, Pave New York, Extreme Winter Recovery, State Touring Routes, and Pave Our Potholes. And we're actually redeveloping our webinar series with the change of the election cycle. We will probably be doing a whole webinar just on this area with state aid. There's enough demand. Um, and so if you think that's interesting, let us know. It helps us decide what we're going to have in our webinar series as we come out with it. But there's lots of possibilities of state aid that are out there. Okay, so keep that in mind. Now, Culvert New York money, which is part of the Bridge New York program. If you're doing Culvert New York money, that is actually state money and it falls under state rules. If you're doing a Bridge New York, over 20 feet, that's federal dollars. Okay, so I just want you to keep that in mind as we're looking at things. And remember, there are lots of other sources. There's departments of state, there's Department of Environmental Conservation, there's the Governor's Traffic Safety Committee, there's Health, Parks and Rec. There's actually quite a few other state things that are out there, okay? Now, what are some sources of federal aid? What are some sources of federal aid? Okay. FAA, FEMA, FHWA, gas tax, that goes back usually to the states. Some states share, some states don't, some share in different ways. The key is federal aid typically is tied to projects off of the national highway system. And even there, it has to all be put into the state transportation improvement program. There are bills out there right now. They're starting the conversation to replace the infrastructure law that's out there right now. I like it only because it makes a fun little, reminds me of the old Bill cartoon in the morning. But the point is, local federal aid is a reimbursement program, whether it's directly from USDOT or through the state DOT, is a reimbursement. You do the work, you get reimbursed, and there are times when you have to stop and wait for authorization to go to the next step. And it can be complicated. We do a whole workshop on this, 3.5 hours of PDHs and 4 hours total. And we go through the process for federal aid. And if you're wondering, yeah, I know it's too small. Um, it's just an illustration. This is the DOT project development process. As a reminder, it's a complicated thing. Here's the thing I want you to think about is what is eligible is something you need to think about. When it comes to federal aid, if it's a bridge over 20 feet or if it's a safety improvement, you're always going to be eligible, but that doesn't mean you're going to be competitive, okay? Because you're going to have to be competing with others to get those funds. And so how you can become more competitive, there's lots of different ways to do that, okay? Um, the big thing there is try to make sure you focus on the needs of the public, no matter what you put in for the competitiveness, okay? Nobody wants to answer that one. We'll probably go ahead and move on then. Now, in terms of any of these aid sources, you're going to be seeking funding. I can tell you right now, the biggest issue that we see when we talk to the folks at both the state and federal level is you have to be realistic and you have to have a good timing and budget. Don't shortchange yourself. If you're replacing a bridge and you need 1.3 million, put in a budget of 1.3 million. If you're doing a safety improvement that costs 250,000, don't put in 200 because you're going to have to make up the difference. If you're buying snowplows to the Department of State, get a realistic price, okay? And I do want to briefly touch on other sources of funds, borrowing funds. I mean, I'm just having a little fun with bond, Mr. Bond there, but bonds, leasing is actually a form of borrowing money. You can setting up your capital reserve funds. What you're essentially doing is you're taking money and setting it aside, or you're borrowing money and then putting out bonds to pay it back later over time. You just have to decide whether it's worth it or not. So for instance, plow trucks, they're getting more expensive every year at a faster rate than interest rates would return the money back to the municipality. So you have to ask yourself, is it worth using bonds or other borrowing formats to finance the cost of the highway department? And the easy way to think about that is ask yourself, would you pay, which of these would you pay for a loan in your own house? Would you pay for dinner with a loan, a wedding, work boots, utility bill, or a new bathroom? You can check all of them if you want. Okay. You're supposed to be able to. So yeah, a new bathroom, I can see that. Okay. Some people would finance a wedding with a loan. I did not, but I can see people who do. But you're not going to finance dinner. You might put it on a credit card just to, again, wait till you pay it all at once. I mean, convenience, but paid off the end of the month, so you don't have interest charges. Okay, use work boots. You're buying them on a regular basis. You're not going to put a loan to do that. So think about it from the standpoint of the Public Works Department. Okay, which of the items would need to be financed? Okay, and I'm gonna clear these real quick. I apologize. I didn't clear them before, so I'm gonna make you redo them. I know I'm a bad boy. Which ones of these would you want to finance? Dump truck, chip seals, rail to trail conversions, tools for the shop, or a new salt barn? Chip seal, probably not. You're doing them on a regular basis. Rail to trail conversion, it depends how extensive it is. If it's extensive, you're only doing it once every 20 years. Yeah, maybe. Certainly not tools for the shop. A new salt barn, again, how often are you doing it? And the dump truck one is actually a classic question. How many dump trucks do you have? If you've got two dump trucks and you buy one every 5 years, financing it might make sense. But if you're buying a new dump truck or two every single year because your fleet's relatively large, are you financing that or you really just want to make that part of your annual operating cost? And so while you have a capital budget, you're really annualizing that. So you need to think about that. Now, what do we need to do next? Well, you need to know your local funding. That's absolutely key. And then you need to realize that some of the aid you get, especially non-local aid, is annual, like CHIPS, for instance. And of course, a lot of funds, especially grants, are going to be part of the State Transportation Improvement Plan, or the STIP. Okay. Now, if you've never done a grant before, you need to learn about what are called NOFOs, Notice of Funding Opportunity. There's a federal one called grants.gov. There's a state one called grantsmanagement.ny.gov. What I would tell you to do, if you're even interested in them, go on those websites. They're in the handout as well. Sign up. You'll get an email daily for opportunities. Okay, you can even filter it by certain opportunities. I have mine filtered to the federal level only through Federal Highway Administration and only certain limited ones. Okay, so I don't actually get an email every single day because there's not a notice of funding opportunity every single day. And the same with the grants management. Okay. Um, Make sure you understand the funding. You got to read the notice, go to the info sessions if they have them. Make sure they match your needs. Okay. And make sure you have a good draft plan and budget in place. Again, that is key. And is there a match? Is it a loan? What's the timeline? When do you actually have to spend that fund? Okay. And so what do we do next? Well, when it comes to grants, especially, is it worth the revenue? And a lot of people don't do federal aid because they don't think it's worth the extra headaches. But on the other hand, some people love it because, well, they're more competitive and they realize it can be bigger projects. The biggest thing I always worry about, though, is can you maintain it after you're done? Okay. Do you have the ability to maintain it? If you're not sure where to get help, go ask and get help. It doesn't hurt. Okay. Have a plan. Make sure that plan is followed. Go get help. The three most common places are state, if you're in an MPO, or even the federal level. And do you have the finances to pay it? Because remember, it's a reimbursement program. And do you have the staff to manage the project? And when you design it, think about, can you maintain it? If you put in a cheap repair that you have to spend a lot of money maintaining it, was it really worth it? Maybe spend a little bit more money up front. Okay. Because what you've got is you've got a capital and operational funds working together, and you got to pay for everything. Okay. Now, I wish we had more time, but we got 1 hour. just want you to think about the fact that you really actually have two budgets. You've got a capital budget and you've got an operations budget, and they have to go hand in hand. When we gone around the state, we actually have no municipalities that had no capital budget for their equipment, zero. And we knew one town that had a $400,000 equipment maintenance budget and no money to replace the equipment. If you flip that and you went to maybe 300,000 for equipment and 100,000 for maintenance, you actually might eventually actually be able to lower that and save money. And they have to go hand in hand with everything. And of course, you have to finance all of this. Now, we are ending our last of our hour. I do want to remind you, we have more webinars coming up. We have surface and subsurface drainage next week. We'll be going throughout the rest of the summer. Some of them are worth professional development hours. And if there's any questions you've got, please send them to us. And again, I do have a request. If you have a purchasing policy you're willing to share, please send it to us. You can just send it to me directly or just our main email address, which is clrp@cornell.edu. And with that, any questions? I don't see anything in the Q&A. Okay. Hopefully everybody got something out of this. And if we don't speak to you before, we'll talk to you next week on the next one of our foundational webinars. Take care, everybody. Have a great day.